Hello and a warm welcome to the Open Treasury podcast, your go-to source for the latest news and analysis in corporate cash and treasury management. This show is brought to you by CTMfile.com and the Treasury News Network, where treasury professionals learn and share the information that matters most. I am your host Pushpendra Mehta, Executive Writer at CTMfile. We are very excited to welcome back Jack Large, Editor of CTMfile, for today's episode. Jack, it's time to get some deeper insights from you on our themes for today, namely UK's profound economic crisis and its new Prime Minister, ESG, cross-border payments, and finally, fraud prevention. Listeners of this podcast can read these articles and also research content more deeply by visiting ctmfile.com or by following the links in our show notes. Jack, our first theme for today is about the new UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak inheriting an economy in turmoil. Sunak takes over as UK Prime Minister amid an economic crisis. The UK economy outlook is stormy, headed for a possible recession with inflation above 10% and interest rates climbing higher. In addition, there's a £40 billion hole to be plugged in British finances, likely to be made up by either freezes or cuts to spending plus higher taxes. While Rishi Sunak has pitched himself as the man to balance the books and bring stability to the country, dire economic headwinds are on the horizon. Jack, are corporate treasurers heartened by the prospect of Rishi Sunak, Britain's former Chancellor, becoming Prime Minister?
Yes, but the problem is that corporate treasurers also look at the markets, and people like Moody's have downgraded the forecast about our future economic stability and so on. And already we are seeing the resigning Prime Minister Liz Truss throwing hand grenades at Rishi, saying that still believe that our tax cutting process was the right thing to do. And we're seeing local parties from the Greens to the Scottish National Party to the Labour Party in Wales, all putting dampeners on the prospects from Sunak's new cabinet and new team. He is very green and relatively inexperienced, and he's already made several errors in his previous time as Chancellor. The issue is going to be preserving the unity of not only the Conservative Party, but also the unity of the UK and building confidence. And already we are seeing people not liking his opening speeches and so on. My advice to corporate treasurers would be very careful about how much you expose yourself to the economics of the UK, I'm afraid.
Interesting. Moving forward, our next theme for today is about ESG. In this section, our first story is about the ESG and cybersecurity connection. Of all the risks, Jack, organizations face today, those related to cybersecurity in the environment carry some of the biggest and most lasting financial damage. The consequences of cyber attacks extend far beyond ransom data and denial of services. It includes attacks on power grids, oil pipelines, manufacturing plants, water treatment systems, wastewater facilities, and communications infrastructure that can cause lasting property and environmental damage. For many corporations, cybersecurity is a critical component of the S pillar in ESG, even though cybersecurity is integral to all the three pillars of ESG, which interlock and influence each other. Jack, given that cyber attacks threaten sustainability investments and ESG risks can trigger cybercrime and conflicts, is it time Treasury considered as the steward of an organization's financial assets integrate cybersecurity and ESG? What is your opinion on this?
I think it's already happening. It isn't just the banks like Deutsche just announcing their new standards. Right? Several American banks have introduced new standards for ESG. Treasurers are asking things like, how are you doing green financing? How are you combining all of the pieces? And the question is, particularly for European treasurers, is they're asking, what do I have to do to comply? Because things are changing so rapidly. It isn't just the countries individually, it's collectively as well. And increasingly, the treasurers are asking things like, how are you dealing with the auditors? How are you dealing with your banks? It's multifaceted, and this is going to become an increasing problem for corporate treasurers throughout the next decade. It's not going away. It's going to get worse, and they're facing up to it now in significant numbers in different ways.
Interesting. The fact that you mentioned it's not going away. And our next story in this section is about Deutsche Bank's announcement that aims to reduce the emissions tied to its upstream corporate oil and gas sector loans by 23% by 2030 as a part of series of targets to help it meet its climate commitments. The bank also announced a set of emissions reduction targets for its €250 billion corporate loan book. Deutsche Bank plans to support a gradual and orderly phase-out of fossil fuel use while also encouraging the financing of lower carbon intensity technologies and clients with credible transition plans. Jack, from a corporate treasury perspective, what do you think are the implications of Deutsche Bank's new carbon footprint reduction goals?
The first thing to say is it's very welcome. It's much more rigorous than before. It's much more all-embracing, and they are starting to actually say, well, if you're going to do things like that against climate change, we're not going to lend to you. And that's the key piece for me in how Deutsche Bank have put out the new controls. But what's also important is they're not the only bank doing this. Behind the scenes, there are many other banks doing the same thing. And it's not just limited to European banks, it's Australian banks, it's US banks. Banks have a critical input here to force, to encourage, to say to corporates, we have to change the way we do business. And one of the ways we're going to change it is we're only going to finance things that are positive and contribute to a lowering of carbon emissions. It's very welcome. And behind the scenes, corporate treasurers are discussing this in great detail.
I'm glad to hear of that. Let's discuss our next theme for today, which is cross-border payments. The first story in this section revolves around revolutionizing cross-border money transfers in Asia with smartphones. Southeast Asian countries ranging from Singapore and Malaysia to Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines desire a multilateral payment network by 2025, according to reports. A payment network upgrade called the Nexus scheme is in place to connect these countries. The Nexus scheme was reportedly envisioned by the Bank for International Settlements as a global payment network. Once the platform is operational, foreign banks can expect to offer competitive currency conversion services through the system, as can customers have the same experience whether they're paying someone near or far. Jack, again, from a treasury perspective, what do you make of scalable payments network like Nexus that can enable multiple countries to offer instant and efficient cross-border payments?
I think Nexus is an example, just one example. There are examples in Scandinavia and around the world of where you're getting countries working together to solve the cross-border payment in new ways, new technologies. The smartphone is becoming ubiquitous here. And what's going to be interesting is how corporate treasury manages the combination of different platforms that they're going to have to use to be able to bring all their payments together. It's not all going to be on SWIFT. It's not all going to be on Visa. Visa dream of it all being on their network, nor on MasterCard. Corporate treasurers are going to work out what combination of networks, payment networks, they use. It's very exciting, but it's also really quite concerning because it's no longer, I just put it on SWIFT. It's now, how do I do it together, whole combination? The other factor is, which is changing the landscape as well, is that things are going to real time or almost real time. And that changes how you manage your foreign currencies, how you manage your liquidity, and how you manage your pooling and other things. It's a revolution right across the whole payment piece.
Revolution right across the payments landscape. And you mentioned MasterCard, you mentioned SWIFT, and you mentioned Visa. Our next story in this section is about Visa partnering with Thunes to help individuals and small businesses move money internationally to 78 digital wallet providers, reaching 1.5 billion digital wallets across 44 countries and territories. Through this collaboration, Thunes B2B payments platform will connect to Visa Direct, adding a cross-border send-to-wallet capacity to 78 digital wallet providers that are already integrated with Thunes. Jack, does this collaboration between Visa and Thunes have the potential to develop a new global era for inclusive and accessible global payments?
I just think it's one of an example of what's going on. Visa is very aggressive here, and quite rightly so, because the opportunity is huge. And the problem for the corporate treasurer is going to be how you manage the different pieces. I would strongly recommend they talk to everybody and then work out what combination they want to get involved in. Again, behind the scenes, corporate treasurers are worrying about this significantly. It's an opportunity in one sense, but it's also a problem in another sense.
An opportunity in one sense and a problem in the other. It's as if our next story, which is about fraud detection as well as the growing menace of frauds, to your point, an opportunity in one way and a problem in the other, is about Global Processing Services, a leading global payments technology platform, announcing its partnership with Featurespace, the world's leading provider of adaptive behavioral analytics for fraud detection and risk management, to create a market-leading issuer processing fraud mitigation solution. Jack, how do you think this partnership can help organizations mitigate the risks associated with payment fraud?
Clearly it can, but again, the question for corporate treasurers is how do they incorporate this fraud protection inside their internal procedures and processes? And that's what's becoming probably central to almost all of corporate treasury is how do you incorporate the new processes, the new way of doing things into what your already existing systems and services. The opportunity is severe. I mean, the fraud reduction from all the areas is really quite significant because with the fraud detection, it starts from the moment the process starts. It doesn't start when it gets to the payment. It starts before then. And this is what's so revolutionary about what's going on now. And again, coming back to the treasurer, the issue is how do I incorporate that into my own processes, my own systems and services? And how do I encourage the banks in the way that is suitable for me? It's a sticky problem that isn't going away, and there are solutions, but it's how do you incorporate this into your own processes and systems?
Next, Jack, I'd like to seek your opinion on your choice for the biggest or the most important story of the past week and why.
I've gone up and down on this. My overall conclusion is that what's really important is the new technologies, new ways of doing things is changing the way corporate treasury is going to need to do business and manage its flows, its liquidity and its foreign exchange exposure and so on. And the issue is going to be keeping on top of all of the different pieces. That is, for me, the biggest thing, because we're now seeing things not just related to SWIFT, not just related to Visa, but every piece of treasury is now under question as to how you should do it in the future.
You mentioned emerging technologies. You mentioned, during the discussion, we spoke about integration, cybersecurity, ESG. If you had to look into the future and advise corporate treasurers, what do you think are some of the most important areas for the latter part of this year that they need to keep in mind going into 2023? Would they be more focused on managing the rise in interest rates? Would it be thinking about recession, which would be on top of mind? Would it be ESG investing? Would it be cybersecurity? Would it be treasury technology, supply chain models, China? What do you think?
There isn't a single thing that isn't important. The issue is how you bring it all together. For me, that's the issue, the key question. The questions coming out of some other work that I'm doing is how do you bring it all together? It's always how do you bring it all together?
Finally, I'd like to wrap up this conversation by asking you, is there any other story or any other opinion that you have on some of the biggest stories or developments or matters that need urgent attention, something that will mandate the attention of corporate treasurers? Anything that you have in mind that you'd like to share with us today?
Stable government is what we need. Obviously, I live in the UK, I work in the UK, and the one thing we don't have is stable, even-keeled government. And that's what business needs above all else. And until you get that, life becomes very difficult. So I would pray, wish for that more than anything else.
And I couldn't agree with you more, because I think stability is the need of the hour for governments and central banks around the world. Thank you, Jack, for your insightful analysis. We would also like to thank our CTMfile audience for joining us in this edition of Open Treasury. Please subscribe and look in the show notes for the article links. Thank you. This podcast is provided for information purposes only, and statements made by CTMfile or guests on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, or consulting advice. For more information, visit ctmfile.com.